Colin Byrnes lives in Sydney and for many years has been a member of the Christadelphian Church or ecclesia at Castle Hill. In the August and September Christadelphian Magazine, Colin wrote a series of articles entitled Comparing Kings and Chronicles, and he seeks to understand the difference between these two books and the purpose behind their writings. And Colin joins us on Wilderness Conversations. Welcome to Wilderness Conversations. The record of the Kings and Chronicles has always had me wondering as to why we have these two records. You suggest they have a historical context and they were written with a particular audience and purpose in mind, which I guess makes sense. I guess most people might assume that the King's record was written first, and that's certainly I did, and that was probably because it occurs first in the scripture. It also occurs first in the Hebrew scriptures, so that kind of makes sense. So the Chronicles record was written subsequently, so I guess the question really becomes, if we already had the King's record, why was there a need to rewrite it or to write a Chronicles record?
Well, I think that the reason for the Chronicles record and the King's record is because they both have different purposes. So the key to understanding why First Chronicles, as First and Second Chronicles were written, is when they were written. And I think there are two important passages that give us a clue. Second Chronicles chapter 36 and verses 19 to 21 tell us about the end of the 70 years of Judah's captivity, prophesied by Jeremiah, that this had come to an end. And then in verses 22 and 23, we have the very familiar Cyrus's decree allowing the Jews to return to Jerusalem and build their temple.
That detail's not in Kings.
No, that detail is actually missing. So in First Chronicles chapter 3 and verse 19, we have the genealogy of Zerubbabel down to his grandsons Pelatiah and Josiah through his son Hananiah. And there no other genealogies or events in Chronicles go beyond this. So this provides us with something of a time frame.
So this puts Chronicles, the writing of Chronicles, well after the children of Israel had gone back to the land after the Babylonian invasion or the 70 years in Babylon. Yes,
the basic time frame for Chronicles is that Zerubbabel officiated at the laying of the foundation of the temple in 536 BC. And if we assume that he was a young prince and allow two generations of 20 to 25 years each down to the inclusion of his mature grandsons in the genealogy, the earliest date for the completion of Chronicles would be around about 490 to 485 BC. And I think that date is supported by the fact that no other events are recorded in Chronicles beyond that. So just outlining the events of that time, in 538 BC, Cyrus issues his decree. Then in 536, the returnees lay the foundation of the temple. And in 516 BC, the temple rebuilding commences in the second year of Darius, and it's completed in his sixth year. 486, at the beginning of Xerxes' reign, the enemies of the Jews in the land stopped the walls of Jerusalem being built. And at this time and shortly after, and still in the reign of Xerxes, Chronicles is written, and it's probably written by Ezra. And in 458 BC, in the seventh year of Artaxerxes, Ezra leads another group of Jews back to the land with permission to refurbish the temple and spiritually purify the people in the land. So Ezra sets about purifying the beliefs and actions of those who'd returned originally under Zerubbabel and Joshua, and begins to build the city walls.
We've done a podcast on Ezra, maybe even more than one, and every time we do it, I'm always amazed at the time frame, which at least in my mind gets lost after the return of them out of the land, because if my calculations are right, you started with the Cyrus decree at 538 and then 558, which is, 80 years later. So you sort of bundle Zerubbabel and Joshua and Nehemiah and Ezra, you're sort of all under the same sort of banner, and it sort of all happened sort of straight after, but there was actually quite a big time frame here.
Yeah.
80 years.
A long period.
Yes. Between.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the book is written at the time that Ezra goes to the land, and most likely by Ezra, who was a scribe, obviously, himself. Why would he have written this book, given that the Kings was already available?
Well, I think the adversaries of the Jews in the land had been troubling them in the reign of Xerxes, and their religious purity had been compromised by intermarriage, as we well know, by the intermarriage with the peoples around them. So Ezra wanted to go up to Jerusalem to prevent the faith being lost altogether. And although the Jews in the land began well, they'd lost their direction. And meanwhile, the Jews in Babylon had become apathetic and comfortable. And we know this because Ezra had to struggle to get Levites and others to form a company to go back to Jerusalem with him. So I think the writing of the book of Chronicles, at least in part, was to encourage people to go back to the land. Now, we might think that the Levites and others would simply jump at the chance to return to their homeland. But when when you ask a few questions, we can see why any enthusiasm for going back to the land may have dried up. For example, you can well imagine that the Levites wouldn't want to leave their comfortable existence in Babylon for discipline of temple service. I'd say for others, would they want to leave their comfortable and prosperous lives in Babylon for the hardship of a long journey and the struggle to establish a new home? And then after 70 years of absence, did they really think they had a right to go back to the land at all? I mean, many were actually born in Babylon, so they had really no association with the land. And of course, they'd established a system of synagogue worship in Babylon. So what was so important about going back to re-establishing the temple in Jerusalem anyway? And, why leave cosmopolitan Babylon for the exclusivism of a Jewish homeland? There have been something like 100 tablets discovered in modern Iraq that revealed just how well the Jews were going in Babylon with their businesses and their lifestyle and so forth. So why would they want to go back?
So Ezra writes the book to encourage them to go back. So what are some of the themes and the ideas that he puts in this book of Chronicles that leads to that end?
I think there are quite a number of them, Steve. The land belongs to all Israel. That's what he wanted to establish. And the remnant that had remained in the land during that exile, he wanted to encourage them. Those who were still in Babylonia, including some of the 10 tribes, he wanted to encourage them. And those, of course, who'd already returned under Zerubbabel and Joshua. And, of course, Judah was the leading tribe that had maintained the purity of the religion after Israel and Judah had separated, so he was trying to encourage them. He's also trying to show that Jerusalem alone is the city of Yahweh and the place that he had chosen for his name. The temple in Jerusalem for all Israel is the only place for acceptable worship and sacrifice. The law must be kept and the prophets accepted. The Levitical priesthood divinely appointed. The only acceptable temple arrangements are those that were instituted by David. The only accepted political authority is the line of David. And if the hope of Israel and true worship were going to revive and survive, all Israel would have to be separate spiritually from the nations around them. So these are the kinds of themes, I think, that run through the book.
So with those themes in Chronicles, which are written by Ezra, can we go back and take a look at Kings and sort of try and establish then when Kings was written?
Yes, I think we can, Steve. And Second Kings, chapter 25 and verses 27 to 30, tells us that in the 37th year of Jehoiachin's captivity in 561 BC, Evil Merodach, as the King James Version calls him, that's Amel-Marduk, the then king of Babylon, brought Jehoiachin out of prison and gave him a place of prominence and treated him kindly. This is the last thing we read of in the Book of Kings.
This was the grandson, always get them mixed up, the last four kings. So it was the grandson of Josiah, the only grandson. The other three kings were brothers. So, in fact, this is the last sort of king of Judah in that sense. And Zedekiah is not actually mentioned in the Book of Kings at all.
So Zedekiah is forgotten once the exile occurs. Zedekiah is forgotten, and it's only Jehoiachin who is mentioned. So this means that looking at this, it means that First and Second Kings were written during the exile and after 561 BC, when Jehoiachin was raised up, and obviously before the end of the Persian Empire. So it looks back over the history of the kings of Judah and Israel, beginning with the last days of King David and ending with Jehoiachin's latter years in captivity. So this is the final scene of Kings, and it reveals, I think it's written in there to reveal a ray of hope for those who are all in captivity.
Yeah, so the Book of Kings is not just a record of the kings for sort of the keepsake sort of thing. It is actually written with a purpose in mind.
That's right.
So what do you think the purpose was in mind for the writing of the Kings record as opposed to the Chronicles record?
Well, I think the writer of Kings is saying that the people of Israel and the people of Judah in particular had found themselves ensconced in captivity in Babylon. And why was that? Well, there had to be an explanation, because their nation was destroyed, their capital city was destroyed, the temple destroyed, the king was in prison. Now, chapters 18 to 25 explain how and what happened, but it's chapter 17 that really summarises why it happened. And when we look at 2 Kings chapter 17, we discover that Israel was thrown out of the land. That when I say Israel, I mean the 10 northern tribes, because they'd walked in the statutes of the heathen. They built high places in the cities. They set up images and groves. They made molten calves, etc., and rejected God's covenant. And of course, as we all know, Judah followed suit. So the central message of Kings is that Israel and Judah had failed to obey their God and had landed in captivity because they'd rejected, and I think this is central to Kings, they'd rejected God's messengers, the prophets. And if they were going to return from captivity successfully, they'd have to listen to God's word through the prophets once again.
So the King's record was completed at around, you suggest, 561 BC, and looks back over the last days of the kings of Judah, when the good figs, to quote Jeremiah, are taken away to Babylon. Zedekiah becomes king. Meanwhile, well, later on, Chronicles was written, probably over 100 years later, in fact, because you've got the 70 years of captivity plus the years from Joshua to Zerubbabel all the way through to Ezra and Nehemiah. So Kings focuses on the reason they're in captivity, written primarily for those who are in captivity. And Chronicles is focused on the re-establishment of the faithful nation in the land, as God intended right back from the time of the Exodus and before. So how does the chronicler sort of differ from the writer of Kings in order to sort of present that message?
Well, I think, Steve, the chronicler draws upon 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and the official annals of the kings of Israel and Judah, and the writings of a number of prophets whose books must have been known at the time, but they weren't included in the canon of Scripture. And so he selects those parts of Israel's history that are going to establish his argument. And the chronicler uses genealogies to establish, first of all, the legitimate line of the monarchy that went down through to Zerubbabel. Secondly, the rightful inheritance of the tribes of Israel. In other words, they did have a right to the land. And thirdly, the legitimacy of the Levitical priesthood. And so he then demonstrates the legitimacy of David's reign and how Yahweh chose the site of the temple and how Yahweh approved the arrangements of the Levites, the priests, singers, temple servants, military and civil rule through David.
So the first few chapters, even I think 3 chapters in Chronicles, focuses on the genealogies. What was so important about genealogies to the chronicler, to Ezra?
Well, the genealogies were really important, and we'll just do an overview of them, and I think we'll arrive at a conclusion as to why they were so important. When we come to this section of Scripture, it's rather tedious going through all the names and trying to pronounce them as we go through, and so we start to wonder, well, why are they all there? So let's try and do an overview of them, and I think we'll discover why those genealogies are there, and we mightn't be so reluctant to read them next time we open up Chronicles. So in 1 Chronicles chapter 1 and verses 1 to 4, we have the line of Adam to Noah traced, and that goes from Adam through to Noah and his sons. Now, at that time, there were other lines that could have been chosen, but this line was chosen because the line through Seth to Noah was the only one that maintained God's truth. So what the chronicler does is create a pattern that we'll see as we read on. The chronicler begins a pattern so that all other genealogies in this instance are pushed aside in order to lead readers to those who were acceptable to God. So how did this help the Israelites of Ezra's time? Well, in the same way as God's truth was held exclusively by only 8 people in Noah's day, it could likewise be held by only Israel among the nations and by only a few among the Israelites in Ezra's day. So, and I guess the same applies to us today. We have to hold on to God's truth, even if our numbers shrink and even if we appear to the world around us to be too exclusive. Now, in 1 Chronicles chapter 1 and verses 5 to 28, we have the genealogies of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, but those of Ham and Japheth suddenly disappear. Now, why? Because God's truth was deposited with Abraham, who came through the line of Shem. Then in 1 Chronicles chapter 1 and verses 29 to 34, we're provided with the genealogies of Ishmael, Keturah, and Isaac. But again, those through Ishmael and Keturah disappear. Why? Because, well, we all know, in Isaac shall thy seed be called. So his line is preserved. Then in 1 Chronicles chapter 1, verses 35 to 54, and chapter 2 and verses 1 and 2, those verses show Isaac's line continuing through Esau and Jacob. And as might now be expected, the line of Esau ceases in the next phase of the genealogies, and only that of Israel continues. And I guess we have to wonder why the chronicler places so much emphasis on Edom's ancient rulers, only to have Edom's ancient rulers disappear from the record. Well, as Chronicles was written to encourage the Israelites of Ezra's day in the land and those in Babylon to rebuild the Commonwealth of Israel, I think he wanted to show that it was Jacob that God had loved and Esau who he had hated. So the Edomites at that particular time of history had assisted Nebuchadnezzar with the destruction of Judah, and by the time of Ezra, they appeared to be prosperous, and they were even encroaching on Judah's territory in the south. So the chronicler was making the point that God had promised prosperity for Israel and not Edom in the ultimate sense. Edom may have been going well at that time, but they weren't going to continue, and it was Israel that would eventually prosper.
That's really interesting. I hadn't noticed that before. It puts a new perspective on Malachi's reference to Edom, who obviously a prophet,
Yes.
probably the last prophet.
And of course, yes, that's right. And I think, therefore, we shouldn't be discouraged by Edom's apparent success, or the children of Israel were not to be discouraged by Edom's apparent success. And subsequent history proved him right, because Edom was a nation that rapidly declined. Now, we notice in the genealogy of Edom's kings the repeated mention of death, which doesn't appear in any of the other genealogies. So there's this repeated mention of death in the list of Edom's kings. So it was just another indicator that Edom was not going to prosper, and Israel would. So then in 1 Chronicles chapter 2 and verses 3 and 4, we're given the 5 sons of Judah, but only the lines of Phares and Zerah are retained. And apparently this was because the other 3 sons were sons of a Canaanitess. And the firstborn of these 3 sons, was slain by Yahweh because of his evil. And the retention of Phares and Zerah, who were not of foreign mothers, makes sense in the context of Ezra, because it was in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, they had to struggle against the corrupting influence of intermarriage with the peoples that surrounded Israel, and particularly those who'd returned under Zerubbabel and Joshua. Then in 1 Chronicles chapter 2 and verses 5 to 9, we've got the line of Phares continuing through Hezron and the line of Zerah ending. Then in the next section of the genealogies, 1 Chronicles 2, 10 to 55 and 3, 1 to 9, we have the lines of Hezron's sons, Ram, Caleb and Jeremiel, but the lines of Caleb and Jeremiel are abandoned because the line of Ram leads to David, who is absolutely central to the chronicler's entire case for establishing correct worship in a restored Israel. Now, we have to remember that it was David who unified Israel, created its empire, captured and built its capital city, and brought the ark to Jerusalem. He prepared for the temple, organised its personnel, established their roles, and founded the line of Judah's monarch. So we can see why this leads to David. Then in 1 Chronicles 3, verses 1 to 9, we're furnished with the names of the 19 sons of David, but it's only the line of Solomon that continues David's line through all the kings of Judah and right through to the period of the exile to Zerubbabel, because obviously it was Zerubbabel who led the first group that returned to the land. And then the line continues to Zerubbabel's grandsons through Hananiah. And the line continues through Zerubbabel, who led the first group of returnees to the land. So these genealogies eventually lead us to Zerubbabel. So what's the chronicler's point? What's he getting at? I think he's saying that the right to hold office, belong to a tribe and inherit a portion of tribal land depended upon Israelites establishing that right by tracing their genealogies back to their forebears who were given that right. So the chronicler traces David's line back to Adam, and these genealogies were extremely important, because we read in Ezra chapter 2, you may remember, an example of those who couldn't provide their genealogical heritage, and which placed them in a very difficult position. Then chapters 4 to 8 are genealogical lists of the 12 tribes to prove to doubters in Ezra's day that they had a right to the land. Then in chapter 9, it's very important because verses 1 to 2 reveal that among the first captives to resettle the land, there were some Israelites, priests, Levites, and temple servants. Now, verse 3 is very interesting because it reveals that in Jerusalem there were representatives of Ephraim and Manasseh, and they were there to represent the northern tribes, and of course representatives of Judah and Benjamin representing the southern tribes. Then in the remainder of that chapter, there are lists. listed by name only the representatives of Judah and Benjamin. Now, why would only the representatives of Judah and Benjamin be given special treatment? Well, I think it's because they were the two tribes that continued on and maintained Jerusalem, the temple, and the true priesthood. So they got extra special mention. So these are followed by the genealogies, the priests, Levites, gatekeepers, those in charge of the items for temple worship, the musicians, the tribe of Levi, whose right it was to carry on this work originally given to their forebears.
So that first section of First Chronicles is all these genealogies, and then pretty much the rest of the book's about David himself, to the exclusion of just about everything else.
Yes, and I think there's good reason for that. For example, when we look at First Chronicles chapters 9 and 10, we're introduced to and describe the rise and fall of Saul. Now, why would that be in there? Well, I think the rise and fall of Saul was to contrast the rise of David, and thus opening the way for Israel's greatest king.
So just to clarify, if you go back to the Book of Kings, you get a lot more detail about Saul, whereas in Chronicles, it's really a summary that introduces David.
Yes, that's what I believe. I believe that's why it's there. And of course, there's a contrast between Saul and David. And so in 1 Chronicles chapter 11 and verses 1 and 2, all Israel came together to David at Hebron. And when the elders of Israel had come to David at Hebron, they made a compact with him there before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel, just as the Lord had promised through Samuel. So chapter 11 begins what's critical to the chronicler's argument, and that is the legitimacy of David's throne for all Israel. In other words, all Israel identified with David and saw him as their leader, even while Saul was reigning, and they acknowledged that God had called David to rule Israel. And they invited David to rule. It wasn't a case of David asserting his right to rule. They invited him to rule. And therefore, all Israel anointed him. So this was important to the Chronicles' argument.
At the risk of interrupting the Chronicles discussion, given the importance of the kingship of David, and there was then a genealogy going down to Zerubbabel, do you think Ezra had in mind, or perhaps another way of asking, why didn't they appoint Zerubbabel as king, do you think?
That's a good question. And I guess it goes back to Ezekiel chapter 25, when it talks about the throne being overturned until virtually, well, basically what it's saying, until a Messiah came to take that throne. So it would appear that they were following David's line, but there must have been some kind of recognition that it wasn't going to be fulfilled in the time of Zerubbabel, and it would be fulfilled in the time when the Messiah came.
Okay, interesting.
So I think this section is important to the chronicler, because it was David who established all the features of the kingdom that lasted through to the exile. And so from this point on, First Chronicles shows just how David established the kingdom of Israel. So in chapter 11 and verses 4 to 9, David overthrew the Jebusites and creates Jerusalem as the capital. Now, I think that's really important that he chose Jerusalem as the capital, because it was in effect on neutral territory. Nobody had taken that city. Nobody at that point had the right to it. But it was David who took the city from the Jebusites and established it as the capital. Then in chapter 11, verse 10 through to chapter 12 and verse 37, we get an outline of the development of David's military power. And then in chapters 13 to 16, they're devoted to David bringing the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. Then chapter 17 outlines David's proposal, plan, and preparations for the temple. And then in chapters 18 to 20, which I find really interesting, because they show that David never set out to purposely create an empire. It was simply that one by one, all of the usual enemies that Israel had to contend with either attacked David and were defeated, or out of fear of his power, voluntarily became allies and vassals. So whatever the reason, David now had the wherewithal to develop Jerusalem and build the temple. Now, I think that that's important. If you have an empire, you have taxes, you can bring tribute, and that brought the wealth that was necessary to establish Jerusalem and build the temple. Then in 1 Chronicles chapter 21, David's fateful numbering of Israel and the plague, I think that we all remember as a result of that. I think it's for the chronicler records it for one main purpose, and that was to reveal where the temple was going to be set up and the right that Israel had the right to that temple because David had bought it from Onan the Jebusite during that period. Then in 1 Chronicles 22, David's desire to build the temple is rejected, and that privilege is handed to Solomon. Then in chapters 23 to 27, these chapters reveal David's arrangements in the temple for the Levites, the priests, the singers, and the temple servants, and so on and so forth. Then in chapter 28, David reminds Israel's leaders that God chose him to lead Israel, and he instructs them to help Solomon in building the temple. And then he hands the plans to Solomon and charges him to see the project through. And then finally in chapter 29, to demonstrate that chapter is to demonstrate that his instructions are not do as I say and not as I do, because David hands over many of his personal treasures to the building of the house of God. And no doubt part of his reason for doing this was to inspire Israel to follow his generous example. So I think that same lesson would have applied in Ezra's day, and of course it does in our own. That we need to be generous in supporting the work of God, whatever that work of God may be at the time.
It's interesting that when you lay it out like that, a couple of things pop out to me. One is the amount of chapters devoted to David bringing the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. That's one. And then the other one is the amount of chapters dedicated to the arrangements of the temple, the Levites and the priests and the singers. And you mentioned the chronologies can get a bit laborious when you're reading them. That section also, there just seems to be an enormous amount of detail, which to us reading it now seems irrelevant. But as you say, it was setting the scene for the captives who were returning and resetting up all of these systems, bringing the Ark back. Well, the Ark wasn't there, but re-establishing the worship in Jerusalem, and also setting up the worship by means of the Levites and the priests and the singers, etc. So yes. Really interesting to see that emphasis.
Yeah, and when you follow it through, you can see where the pattern is heading. That's the first book of Chronicles. The second book of Chronicles is easier to summarize, because in the second book of Chronicles, the chronicler looks at the kings of Judah and judges them by the degree to which they guard the land, the city, the temple, the priesthood, the people, and the law. So those kings who carry out that work faithfully receive long and detailed attention, while those who do not are given very little attention in the book of Chronicles. So when you're reading the kings, the lives of the kings in 2 Chronicles, you can judge their reigns by that particular criteria.
I think the Kings and Chronicles are a little bit like the gospel records. Because we read them in parallel, you can miss the themes of the actual book itself. And it hadn't really occurred to me before that in Chronicles we get virtually no reference to the kings of Israel. I mean, I may have noticed it before, but it's fresh in my mind right now. So it focuses on the establishment of the kingdom under David and Solomon. And then in 2 Chronicles, it's just the kings of Judah. And in particular, most of it's about Hezekiah and Josiah, because they are the two sort of standout kings that are going to be the example for the captives who are returning. If we go to then Kings and consider how then that differs, how does the writer of Kings use his writing style, and what's he emphasizing in the book of Kings so that Judah and Israel can understand why they're in captivity?
Steve, I believe the author of Kings draws upon the annals of the kings of Israel and Judah. That is the official records of the kings of Israel and Judah, to demonstrate that Israel and Judah had failed in their responsibility to keep God's covenant. They'd failed to keep the law, they'd failed to uphold the temple, and they'd failed to uphold the true priesthood. So Kings centres on the role of God's messengers, the prophets, and of Israel and Judah's constant rejection of the word of God that had come through the prophets. So what we find in Kings is that various prophets are intimately involved in the lives of the different kings of Israel and Judah, and they're closely involved in major turning points in the history of Israel and Judah. For example, Nathan the seer was the one who helped settle the issue of who was to succeed David. Then we've got Elijah the Shilonite. Now, this prophet revealed to Jeroboam that that he would be given the 10 northern tribes of Israel because of the way in which Solomon had forsaken the covenant. Then you've got Shemaiah, the man of God, who prevented Rehoboam making war against the northern tribes. And then you've got the man of God who announced God's judgments against Jeroboam over the 2 sanctuaries that were built at Bethel and Dan. And then the man of God himself received God's judgment for listening to it and eating with the old prophet. Then you've got Ahijah, the prophet, who predicted the destruction of the house of Jeroboam. You've got the prophet Jehu, who pronounced God's judgment against the house of Baasha. And then in 1 Kings chapter 16 through to 2 Kings chapter 13, you've got the history of Elijah and Elisha and the miracles that they performed and the way that they stood up to Jezebel and Ahab and so forth. So these great prophecies given by Kings emphasises Elijah and Elisha in a way that Chronicles simply doesn't. So then we have Jonah predicting the 41-year reign of prosperous reign of Jeroboam II. We don't need to even think about the importance of Isaiah in relation to the life of Hezekiah. And then, of course, we have Huldah the prophetess in the reign of Josiah, when the book of the law was discovered, and telling Josiah what Josiah was to do and what was going to happen to Israel after the discovery of the book of the law.
We could probably rename the book of Kings and the prophets, because it's,
yes.
A lot of it is hinged around the activity of the prophets.
Yes.
So just summarising, again, the author of Kings explains how and why Israel and Judah went into captivity, into Assyria first, Israel, and then Babylon for Judah. And that's around a lot of the proclamations of the prophets. That's why they're so important. Whereas the chronicler, by contrast, explains how Judah and Israel can return back to the land, why they should return back to the land, and the importance of re-establishing worship in a correct fashion back in the land of Israel.
Yes, well, I think these are the basic differences between the two books, but there are other major differences also as we run through them. And if I can just summarise some of those. For example, Kings has no genealogies, and yet the first 9 chapters of Chronicles are full of genealogies. Kings references 2 archetypal kings, David and Jeroboam, whereas Chronicles only emphasises, or mainly emphasises, David as the archetypal good king. And then we've got Kings deals with all the northern northern and southern kings, as you mentioned before, and Chronicles only considers the kings of Judah. The northern kings are only mentioned incidentally when they come into contact with or intersect with Judah's kings. And of course, Kings explains how the Samaritans came into being, whereas Chronicles ignores the Samaritans, because in the days of Ezra, these people mixed the law of Moses with their own religion and became the enemies of the re-establishment of the Commonwealth. Then Kings asserts that true worship is only possible in the Jerusalem temple, and condemns those centres of worship that are established at Bethel and Dan by Jeroboam, whereas Chronicles also regards the temple as the centre of pure worship, but it emphasises the many temple rituals, ceremonies and arrangements that were introduced by David. And then Kings has a very heavy emphasis on the prophets, whereas the Chronicler mentions the prophets, but in a much lighter way. Then Kings concentrates on the political, administrative, and military contribution of the various kings, whereas Chronicles tends to emphasise kings like Jehoshaphat, Hezekiah, and Josiah, who are given detailed treatment because of their purges of idolatry and their religious reforms. And then in the parallel accounts of David's numbering of Israel, for example, the one is in 2 Samuel chapter 24 and 1 Chronicles 21, it's only the chronicler who records that David declared that the threshing floor of Onan was to be the site of the temple. So you've got all these contrasts between these two books.
We've mentioned that it's probably Ezra that writes the book of the Chronicles, and I think that's consistent with Jewish tradition as well. Is there any Jewish tradition, and do we have any clues as to who might have written the book of Kings?
Well, I think, Steve, 1st and 2nd Kings concentrates on the importance of the role of the prophets, as we've already said. But from the reign of Josiah to the death of Zedekiah and on to Jehoiachin's release from his Babylonian prison, it's remarkable that there's not a single mention of Jeremiah, in spite of the fact that he walked as we might say, as a colossus in this period of Judah's history. So we ask the question, why is that? Why do we get no mention of Jeremiah in the book of Kings during that period when he was most active? Now, even Chronicles, which doesn't emphasize the prophets, refers to Jeremiah 5 times. So why is there a contrast with 2 Kings, which does emphasize the prophets? So the two books of Kings place a heavy emphasis on the vital role of the prophets, but not once do they mention Jeremiah. And yet, with the exception of Isaiah, he is arguably the most important prophet of that era. Everyone contemporary with Jeremiah who read Kings would know if it was written by him, and they would be aware of Jeremiah's close involvement in the colossal events of that time. So what I'm suggesting is this would explain why the last chapters of both 2 Kings and Jeremiah are almost identical word for word, and both conclude with the hopeful description of Jehoiachin's release from prison by evil Merodach. So I just pose the question, is it possible that Jeremiah could have ended up in Babylon as an old man and wrote these final words there in Babylon? Now, of course, one tradition has it that disgruntled Jews stoned Jeremiah to death in Egypt, but when Nebuchadnezzar conquered Egypt 5 years after the fall of Jerusalem, Josephus tells us that Jeremiah was actually taken to Babylon by the Babylonians. So when he arrived in Babylon, he would have been around about 82 years of age when the last words of the books of Kings and Jeremiah were written in 561 BC. So I think that would explain how the prophecy of Jeremiah was preserved and why Jeremiah is not mentioned in 2 Kings. If Jeremiah wrote both books, it would have to be known at the time, and it would have been unnecessary to name Jeremiah as the author of the Kings.
It's really fascinating. I hadn't really thought of Jeremiah as being that. It's interesting that when you look at the prophet Jeremiah, the writings, the book of Jeremiah, if you want to learn a bit about Jehoiakim, you have to go to Jeremiah. It's not actually in the record of the Kings or the Chronicles. In fact, there's quite a few chapters in Jeremiah, and I don't have a photographic memory, but I can even tell you what the chapters are. They're 22, 26, and 36, because I happen to be looking at them recently. And you can actually get a lot of detail about what was going on in those last sort of 11, 22 years of Israel's history. And that would seem to make a lot of sense to me, what you're saying, because if Jeremiah is recording it in the book of Jeremiah, then he's not putting it in the book of Kings, because he's actually already recorded it in the prophecy of Jeremiah, which may add some weight to the argument. So I think that's really interesting.
Just as a little aside, we wonder why in the reign of evil Merodach, Jehoiachin should suddenly be brought up out of the prison and treated kindly. And you think, well, what was it that influenced him to do that? And I just posed the question. There were two very influential Jews in Babylon at that time. If we say that Jeremiah was there, we've got Jeremiah and we've got Daniel.
Mm.
And it seems to me that both of those men may well have appealed to evil Merodach, because both men were respected by the Babylonians. They may have appealed to evil Merodach to bring their king, king who was languishing in prison, and bring him back to a point where he's being treated much more kindly.
One of the things we often hear from the critics of the Bible, they probably focus more on the Gospels, but it appears in Kings and Chronicles as well. Anytime you've got a parallel record, they like to point out that there's contradictions between the records. There's internal inconsistency in the Bible. But in fact, we would argue, the opposite. There's strong internal evidence that the scriptures are inspired by God. And even just the brief description you've given over the reasons these books were written, I think, add a tremendous amount of weight to that. Are there examples where there might be contradictions, or where people identify contradictions that we can consider?
I think there are, Steve. For example, in 2 Kings chapter 21 and verses 1 to 18, there's not a single word, there's not a single good word spoken about Manasseh. And if we read that record, his sins are given in detail. You know, his rejection of God's prophets and his utter betrayal of Yahweh and his covenant with Israel. And it's only in 2 Chronicles that we're told that Manasseh's prayerful repentance and of his acceptance of the words of the prophets, and his purge of the worst forms of idolatry in the land, and his restoration of the city, the temple, the priesthood, and the law. So why is there such a difference, a sharp difference between the two records of the reign of Manasseh? So, well, I think 2 Kings emphasises the impact of Manasseh's 55-year reign that corrupted the people and led ultimately to Judah's destruction and captivity, whereas 2 Chronicles emphasises and illustrates the main temple and religious theme of the book by looking at Manasseh's restoration of those things. Now, I think there are other places where the records of Kings and Chronicles appear to be contradictory, but if they're read through the filter of the different purpose and scope of each book, I think those contradictions quickly evaporate. For example, the condemnatory assessment of Abijam's reign in 1 Chronicles chapter 15 and verses 1 to 8 seems to contradict the favourable assessment of his reign in 2 Chronicles 13. So we ask why the sharp difference? Well, I think it's because Kings looks at his reign in its entirety, while the Chronicles looks at only one portion of his reign that provides evidence for the chroniclers' treatise. So we look at Abijam's reign. The Chronicles emphasises the fact that he stood up to the power of Israel and fought on behalf of Judah to maintain the city and the temple and so forth. But that contrasts with the overview that we see from Kings.
Well, I think I will read the book of Kings and Chronicles in a new light after this, so I found that very helpful. Is there a final message for us today, do you think, that comes out of this?
Well, I think, Steve, as we've seen, the two authors write with very different purposes in mind, and although in many places they dovetail, in others they are quite different and can appear to be even contradictory. But once we understand the general purpose of each book, I think we can draw out a lot of great lessons relating to our Heavenly Father's plan with the earth, our relationship to him, and great principles for conducting our ecclesias, and I think important principles to apply generally in our lives. And I think that's one of the benefits of understanding these two books and why they cover the same period of history, but they cover it so differently.
Thank you very much for joining Wilderness Conversations.
Pleasure, Steve.